Before we start piecing, you're going to cut out your squares and pre-sew your half square triangles. The instructions that you download are going to tell you how many you need to do that. Now, we're going to be piecing on our easy piecing grid, and I just kind of wanted to show you that this is what it's going to look like. So when we're piecing on a foundation, we are changing a little bit about how we're looking at putting this quilt together. Instead of thinking about strip piecing or piecing block by block, what we're doing is we are taking the quilt. I'm going to show you, this is a picture of our whole quilt, and we are going to divide that quilt up into sections that represent this panel. Now, do you see where this quilt has been divided up? It's not dividing up equally. So we're going to be talking about doing these smaller pieces with our leftover grid that we are using. So we're using our 1.5 inch finished grid, but I guess I'm going to need my layout. But we are going to be using 4-inch squares instead of 2-inch squares. We're going to be placing a 4-inch square over the top of 4 squares. Now, one thing I want to explain about the easy piecing grid is when we print this grid, each of these squares are printed just slightly bigger than your cut size. And the reason for that is if we were piecing with 2-inch squares, we want to give you room to fold. What you don't want in your seam allowance is fabric. So these squares are printed just a tiny bit bigger. So what that means is when we go to piece a larger square over the top of 4 of these squares, this is not going to be 4 inches in a measurement. This is actually going to be more like 4 1/8. Now, typically, I would never cut a 4 1/8 inch square, but to cover this square, that's what I'm suggesting. So your half square triangles and your squares are going to be cut just a little tiny bit bigger than 4 inches, just to accommodate that. That actually brings up a good point though. One of the great concepts of piecing on a foundation is that your cutting does not have to be perfect because the foundation is. As long as these are fitting inside this square, and as long as that fits safely in your seam allowance, they are going to turn out great every single time. Now, one thing that I want to point out is that because we are putting a square of fabric over the top of 4 squares, if I don't want to use a like a pure white fabric here, because what will happen is I'm going to possibly see some of this printing line on my fabric. I guess I shouldn't say you shouldn't. What I should say is if you do want to use a really lightweight, a light colored or a white fabric on your square, then what I suggest is just doubling up that square. For instance, you would put a pure white square down, and then if I had a really sheer polka dot, and I would put that over the top of it, or doubling up that fabric if it's really lightweight. Otherwise, I love using a fabric that's got just a little bit to it. Now I forgot where I was. Here we go. So what I like about piecing on the grid also is that technically we are looking at a picture of our quilt. And one thing that I laugh, see my stack, one thing I laugh about quilting instructions is that they will always tell you exactly how many squares or half square triangles to cut out. And what I typically do is I will make way more than I need. But I think that's one of the things I really like about quilting is that you kind of get to do what you want. And there's not very many rules. So let's see if we can get a nice little contrast of fabrics. This is also really nice because we get to see what this looks like before you ever start to sew. So especially if you're going scrappy, then we are able to really see what that's going to look like. And we're going to put our solid square here. So if you like If you like puzzles, if you have someone in your family that isn't necessarily a quilter, but they like patterns and they like, I guess, putting together puzzles, then you've got a new piecer in your family. All right, let's go here. I'm going to put this one right here. And I've got a couple of solid squares. And then we're going to place this one. Now, I want to just talk about a couple of things. When we look at the layout, this is actually the section that I am piecing right now. So it's just these 3 blocks this way and these blocks across this way. And I only needed to piece that section. I want to just talk a little bit about the placement. Now, we talked about how because you're piecing on a foundation, your cutting does not have to be perfect because that foundation is. But when we're piecing with half square triangles, it becomes all about those points. We want to get really nice points. So the trick for getting really nice points is when you place a half square triangle, we just want to make sure that that seam of the half square triangle is lining up from corner to corner. Now we're going to define the corner by this little tick or this little plus mark that defines each of those corners of the grid. Now, the other thing that I do want you to notice is that my cutting is not perfect, but these are fitting inside those squares. I do want to be careful that fabric is not overlapping each other, because remember, we don't want fabric in that fold. Before I go to the iron, I'm going to just double check that my seams for half square triangles are lining up from corner to corner. Now I've got the Elmer's glue stick here because we are piecing. In fact, when we're ironing the squares on, that's what I call the piecing, because that is where you're being creative. That is really where you're doing the work. The sewing should be the hardest part, but it's actually the easiest part of the whole process. But if you are not piecing on top of a pressing board or an ironing board, the Elmer's washable glue stick is a starch-based product. And so you can put, I usually just put a little, more than a dab, just a little swipe of that glue. What you're doing is you're just holding that square in place until we can take this to the big iron. But when I am piecing on top of a pressing board, this is why I love my little mini irons. So when I'm piecing on top of a pressing board, oh gosh, I forgot to tell you the most important part of the whole process. I got so excited. When you're piecing on the foundation, the most important thing to remember is having this fusible side up, because we're going to press this down. So you can imagine what would happen if the fusible side was down. I would not be happy. So you want to make sure that that bumpy or fusible side of your foundation is up. So because that fusible side is up, obviously all this area outside of my pieced squares is fusible. So I love the little mini irons because it's going to let me, I'm just basically holding for 2 or 3 seconds. You want to make sure your iron is nice and hot. I just use a dry iron at this point. Now I'm not trying to iron the whole square securely. We're going to do that with the big iron and some steam. But I am holding these in place. Remember, be really careful that this is all fusible. And so far I do not have a class on how to clean off your iron, though there are some good tips for that. So you want to make sure that you keep that iron away from the fusible. And I'm just tacking this down so that I can be ready to put the big iron on. So if I was doing this on a tabletop and I needed to pick this up and carry it, see how these are nice and stuck on, but before you sew, you don't want anything lifting up. You want this to be really, really nice and secure. And so I am going to do this with the big iron just because I've done this before. You can trim everything off before you iron, or you be really careful not to get this on your fusible. Now, when I say I like to use steam, you can hear that steam. I like to steam and then hold 2, 3, 4, steam and hold. That steam is going to just really help to activate that fusible part of our foundation. There we go. See how nicely? What I love is that you, especially after you press it, you really see even better what your quilt top is going to look like. So let's say we've finished our pressing and you step back and you realize, oh, I've got a half square triangle turned the wrong way, or oh, I put 2 of the same fabrics together and I didn't want to do that. These will peel right up, especially when it's warm. If you have any trouble peeling it up, then just bring the iron over, give it a little shot with some steam, and this will peel right up really easily, and then you can fix it and do what you want. So now we have this section of our quilt finished, and we are going to put our sections together so that we have one quilt top all ready to sew. So what I like to do, I'm going to turn this way. I like to trim right up next to the fabric. Now this is really easy to do on your cutting mat with a ruler, but you can see that I'm cutting right up next to the fabric. I don't want anything sticking out. We'll kind of talk about that in a little bit when we are ready to sew. All right, so this is the piece that we just finished piecing. And as you can see, we've got the rest of the quilt all ironed on and ready to go. Now, I want to refer back to our quilt layout. Remember that we took the whole quilt and we divided it up into sections. So I just kind of want to explain these sections. So this section and this section and this one that we just finished took up most of one of the easy piecing panels. And then this little section here and then this little corner here, we use the leftovers from those panels to create these last 2 sections. So now what we're going to do is we are going to put all these together so we have one quilt top. And the great thing about that is that if you want to do a section this size, then there's no pinning. So I'm gonna show you how to sew up this whole quilt top with no pins. So remember when we finished this section, I had you cut right next to the fabric all the way around it. Now, when we're piecing our panels and we know that we are gonna fuse 2 sections together, you can leave a little lip of that foundation sticking out, usually anywhere from a good 1/4 to a 1/2 inch. That's what is left over on the side of the panel that we ironed onto. But if you have cut all the excess away like we did on this one, then I want to show you an easy way to fuse these 2 sections together. So we're going to fuse this one and this one together and then add it to our big one. So remember that bumpy side is the fusible side. So I've cut a little strip anywhere from a 1/2 to 1 inch wide just from your leftover, and then I'm going to just lay my section over the top of it halfway, making sure that fusible side is up. Now remember, it will stick to the iron if we get the iron on that little tab, and so I'm just making sure I'm really careful with the iron. You can hit that steam if you want to, and I'm just holding that on for a few seconds. So now that little tab is all nice and fused on. Just going to trim that excess off. So now we're going to bring the other section over. Now, a really important thing to remember is, I keep saying this, remember that we are piecing according to the foundation, which means that these fabric squares might not all be exactly the same size. So when I am matching this up, I get my nice little iron. This is what I like these little irons for. So when I am matching up these two sections, I am not trying to match up my exact fabric squares. What I'm matching up, and it might be a little bit hard to see, but I am matching up that little dotted line that is the printed grid. That's what I'm matching up. I am matching up the foundation, not the fabric squares. Let's see if that's gonna hold. I'm gonna hit that. Probably shouldn't say hit. I'm gonna touch this with a nice hot iron and some steam. We should probably never hit. All right, now this is beautiful. We've just eliminated the pinning between these two sections. So now let's move this one a little bit closer. And we're going to fuse these two sections together. Again, I want to remember that we are matching up, and I just go little by little. Now, one thing that I want to show you, remember when we trimmed all the way around this piece? I said trim right up next to the fabric. You see right here, I've got a little bit of that foundation sticking out. And if I just matched these up, do you see how that's going to, that fusible is going to be laying on the other piece of fabric that I'm matching it to. So I am going to go ahead and trim that out of the way. It seems just like a little insignificant piece, but it will come out a lot nicer and you won't have any fusible overlapping. So we're going to match up that grid. I kind of like to just go along, and you can kind of see where that dotted line comes down. Hit that with the steam and the iron. Keep coming along. See, sometimes because fabric shrinks or stretches as you're pressing, sometimes, see, I'm giving that a little tug and telling you, you need to be right there. Well, I've got another little spot that I'm going to trim off. So good idea to keep your scissors handy when you're fusing these two sections together. Coming down. So again, it's steam, hold, 2, 3. See how nice it is to have a nice big pressing board. I better get that section. Or a nice long ironing board. It's going to come in really handy. Let's slide this down. Now, one thing I want to point out is that you do not have to fuse your whole quilt top together. I will go to great lengths to not pin. And so I am putting this whole quilt top together. But you can piece just a section at a time and sew that up. And then you will just pin them together when you sew your sections together. So don't let this scare you. But basically, whatever size you feel like you can manage, then there's no pinning. And now we are ready to sew.